Hello, dear viewers of the Day TV channel. Today we have our third podcast with cameraman Leonid Konovalov. Once again, we will be discussing the American moon missions. Today's agenda includes Apollo 15 and 16. These missions differed from the previous ones because rovers were used, and NASA shows footage of American astronauts driving these vehicles on the lunar surface. However, Leonid Konovalov will be explaining with specific examples how all this footage could have been shot under earthly conditions. Good afternoon. So, shall we start with Apollo 15?
Yes, let's start with Apollo 15. I would like to focus not just on how this could have been filmed on Earth, but also on the fact that there are many similarities between the composite shots in the movie Terminator and the footage of the rover driving on the moon, as well as other scenes. The Apollo 15 mission is also notable because, just recently in November 2023, our President Vladimir Putin attended an international conference on artificial intelligence. There, he was shown an American software by Google that can detect fakes and falsifications in images. They demonstrated how this program, I emphasize, an American program, was tested on NASA's moon surface photos. Many images from this moon mission were highlighted in red, indicating that these parts look insufficiently credible. We can see that the astronaut itself is highlighted. I found this photograph. It's from the Apollo 15 mission. However, I don't like the word, mission. I know that it's not a mission at all. It's just an Apollo 15 photo album. There was no real mission.
Mission, like Messiah, is a very pretentious term, which is why you don't like it.
The fact is that there was no actual mission. It was just a series, mostly shot using composite filming techniques. In this photograph, the astronaut is supposedly collecting soil samples. We can see that not only his figure is highlighted, but also the hillside behind him. When I found this photograph in the magazine, I saw that it's a panorama. That means that supposedly on the moon, one astronaut is digging in the soil while the other is photographing and panning around to the right, clockwise. We can see that part of one image overlaps with another, meaning it's a continuous panorama. If one photograph in this panorama is deceitful, then all the images in this panorama are equally deceitful. We can see the rover in the image. Besides the rover you mentioned, do you know what else interesting appeared in these Apollo 15 and 16 missions? Look, what's behind the rover?
Ah, mountains.
Of course, mountains. And there are a lot of mountains in Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and even 17. But if we go back to the first Apollo, Apollo 11, which supposedly first landed on the moon, we see that right behind the shadow of the lunar module, the moon seems to end. In fact, we won't keep secrets. All this was filmed.
There's a black void.
There's black velvet.
It's like the Earth is flat and so it ends there.
Similarly, I looked at other circular panoramas. Maybe not a full circle, but a part, a sector. You can see that there are no mountains anywhere. I took another mission, called Apollo 12. I also looked at a panorama that goes around in a circle. We see that almost everywhere the horizon is quite flat. No mountains can be seen in the distance. The 13th mission supposedly flew by the moon, and in Apollo 14 there are no mountains either. In fact, impressive mountains appeared only in Apollo 15. Why weren't they there? The technology for projecting giant mountains onto a large screen was developed by Stanley Kubrick, and the entire Space Odyssey is essentially a cover operation. For example, if we look at the Dawn of Man sequence from Kubrick's film, we can clearly see that the mountains in the background are projected from a slide. What was the difficulty? For the mountains to be majestic, the screen width had to be at least 30 meters. Kubrick managed to make the screen width 32, almost 33 meters, and the height 12 meters. Part of the mountain image is a projection from a slide projector, and the foreground, where the primitive apes are, or what are they called?
Hominids or anthropoid apes. Initially, they wanted to use trained animals, but then they realized it was impossible for the animals to perform as required. The costume specialist struggled to make them look realistic. Kubrick drove him crazy with his wishes and desires. It was maddening with what he wanted. By the way, I know they actually sent an expedition to Namibia to take the slides. So, the background is real.
The thing is, they first tried using a small slide, about the size of our 9 by 12 centimeters. But then, when projected onto a large screen, the graininess of the image became visible, and it was clear that these were composite shots. Therefore, the shooting was done with a very large format camera, where the size was practically like a letter-size sheet, 20 by 25 centimeters. There was no projector for such large slides because the size was very large and non-standard. So, Stanley Kubrick asked engineers to develop such an unusually large slide projector. I will show later what it looked like in reality. Why did they abandon using animals? The fact is, Kubrick was a very meticulous person and sometimes shot 30 to 40 takes. Animals simply couldn't handle that many takes. Moreover, even no human could endure that. So, do you know who stands in for people in the lunar footage? Mannequins. I will talk about this now. And here is a working moment from the Space Odyssey production, particularly the Dawn of Man sequence. Here we see this very large screen. Visually, it appears gray. It is a very tricky material called Scotch light. What's special about this material? It consists of very tiny glass beads. There are approximately 250 to 300 beads per inch. It's like a tiny dot in a printer. This material has a very interesting property. It reflects light back to the source. Initially, cinema used the technique of projecting slides onto a white screen. But in this case, the light scatters in different directions, and if you illuminate the actor as on a sunny day, it's impossible to create a very bright image on the screen behind. Therefore, the white screen wasn't suitable, and Kubrick used a material from 3M, called Scotch light, which began to be widely used for road signs. What's interesting here? In this image, there are lighting fixtures, here on the side. They are specifically directed so that the spotlight beams do not hit the screen. So, when we start watching the lunar footage, I see that the astronaut's shadow falls towards the camera, meaning the light is side or back side. This is done so that the screen does not get lit up by the spotlight. Kubrick started collaborating with NASA. His main achievement was making the projection on a giant screen possible. Even in our movie theater October, one of the largest movie theaters in our country, The screen width is 27 meters, but here it is more than 30. Since preparing to shoot these scenes took a lot of time, it is not a person in this footage, but a stand-in mannequin. It is very lightweight, about 22 kilograms. If it were a real actor, they would need to smoke, go to the washroom, have lunch, and they would leave unnecessary traces. Then people would say, "Look, there are mistakes. Extra footprints suddenly appeared in the neighboring image. These are film bloopers, something smells fishy." So, mannequins were used here. Apparently, Stanley Kubrick began collaborating with NASA back in 1965 when he signed a contract with them, 4 years before the first supposed moon landing. You will surely recognize these characters here.
I was at his home in Sri Lanka.
Really?
Yes, though it was after he had already passed away. I was in his apartment. Clark is a well-known writer.
And you know Frederick Ordway, right?
It seems that Ordway worked with von Braun. Braun made a series in the 50s about exploring the solar system, and he was involved in special effects. Kubrick took him on precisely because he was good at special effects and small spacecraft.
The main task given to Kubrick was to create a giant screen onto which mountain images would be projected, as everyone understood that there had to be mountains on the moon. Therefore, for the landscape in Space Odyssey, images of mountains were projected onto the background for that episode. It was assumed that the moon landing would take place early in the lunar morning, when the shadows are long. Hence, in many shots, there are long shadows from the mountains. In this shot, the mountain is from a slide, and the foreground, where the animals and apes are grazing, was built in the studio, with the task being to seamlessly blend the set with the background so that the transition line wouldn't be noticeable. What do we see here? We see that the edges are still darkened, meaning it was impossible to achieve uniform illumination of the entire area on a wide screen. Therefore, they concluded that they wouldn't shoot a wide picture but a square one, which would eliminate the defects we now see at the edges. If you look closely, you can see lines in the sky. The fact is, the Scotch light they used was small in size. To make a 30-meter screen, they joined various pieces together. Interestingly, one batch differed from another. So, they took one piece from one batch and one place, and moved it to another, like a patchwork quilt, to achieve a more or less uniform reflective capability. What's interesting about this material? If you direct a spotlight or flashlight at it, it starts brightly glowing, but in diffuse light, it looks completely gray. I brought this material, Scotch light. Now we'll ask the cameraman to direct the flashlight's beam into the picture. The light from the flashlight hardly increases in the background, but the Scotch light material starts brightly glowing. If we move the flashlight away or lift it up, the light disappears. It's immediately evident that the brightness increases significantly. If you precisely align the camera lens and the flashlight, then compared to a white screen, the brightness increases by about 100 or even 120 times. Since the screen became 120 times brighter, we can now project giant images onto it, but with one condition. Such high brightness is seen by only one person who is exactly on the axis of the lens. And since it's impossible to position the slide projector on the axis where the camera lens is, because the slide projector or the operator would block the lens with their head, A semi-silvered mirror is placed in the middle. We see a diagram showing how shots were taken using the front projection technique. This technique is so named because both the camera and the projector are in front of the screen. They are positioned at a 90-degree angle to each other, with a semi-silvered mirror at a 45-degree angle between them. Thus, the projector beams reflect off the mirror and go onto the screen, reflecting off the screen and, as the yellow-orange line shows, directing light into the movie camera. Here, a few questions arise. People ask, well, how can that be? After all, there would be a shadow behind the ape or primitive man. What to do? The fact is, if you precisely align the lens of the video projector, reflected in the mirror, with the lens of the camera, it turns out that the two lenses are in the same spot, and the shadow is hidden directly behind the figure. And what's most interesting, this rig weighed about a ton, maybe even more, and it couldn't be moved closer to the screen, as that would reduce the scale of the mountains in the background. Therefore, there was a rigid connection between the screen and the rig. This is roughly how it would look if we stepped back a bit and took a look. So, in the foreground, we have the camera and video projector in the corner, the semi-silvered mirror, and the screen behind, which is 12 meters high and almost 33 meters wide. With this camera, we can pan a little to the left and a little to the right, but not beyond the 33 meters. This is roughly how it all looked. Here is a famous photograph. An astronaut saluting the American flag supposedly on the moon. We see that in reality, the camera is in front, and if the projector is turned off, the image on the screen disappears. Later, I'll come back to this shot. The sun's light is imitated as follows. Our opponents ask me, how can that be? In the moon's surface images, we see that the light source is very far away, the shadows run parallel. If we extend the shadows and connect, say, the top of the shadow's helmet and the astronaut's helmet, we get a line extending about 80 meters high. What kind of studio is 80 or 90 meters tall? That's 25 or 30 stories. Where have you seen a studio as tall as a 25-story building? What would support such a giant ceiling? If such a studio were built, it would be the eighth wonder of the world. There are only 7, right? And this would be the 8th, can you imagine?
The 7 wonders of the ancient world.
If the studio were as tall as, say, half or a quarter of the Ostankino Tower, everyone would know about such a marvel. But it doesn't exist. The explanation is simple. Filmmakers wouldn't be filmmakers if they hadn't figured out how to do all this in other ways. They placed a spotlight on the floor and attached a parabolic mirror, about 2 meters in diameter, to the ceiling. Several spotlights, up to 20, shone into this mirror, making the light go up, reflect off the mirror, and appear to come from above. In reality, the light source, an arc projector used for illuminating airport runways, was on the ground. That's the answer to the enigma of this shot. If we look at the behind-the-scenes moments of filming Space Odyssey, we'll see Stanley Kubrick standing with a viewfinder, carefully checking for contour shadows to ensure no one could guess. This rig was actually this size. Here we see two images taken from different angles. In the left picture, there's a projector for giant images, almost the size of a letter sheet. Further back is the semi-silvered mirror reflecting the movie camera. This is the same rig, but now from the perspective of the filming camera. Why am I showing all this in detail? Because they say, these lunar shots were taken with a Hasselblad camera, specifically this shot. But I say, not at all. This lunar Hasselblad weighs a ton. It's a giant rig. So, you can note that under the guise of a lunar Hasselblad, a giant rig weighing about a ton was used. The Hasselblad is just a cover story. They had to come up with something. Why do I state this so definitively? Because I see that if an astronaut, or even an actor in the studio, had a Hasselblad, he could take pictures to the left, to the right, make a panorama, move closer, or step back. But with such a rig secured to the screen, we can't move it closer or further away. The scale of the mountains would change. If we look at a series of iconic presentation photos of astronauts on the moon, with a mountain in the background, a rover, and the American flag nearby, we'll see that all these shots look similar. This means front projection was used for these shots. The only option left was to turn the camera slightly to the left or right, not to go beyond the screen in the background. So, just a little to the left, a little to the right, and that's it. But people will definitely say, look, the astronaut is slightly bigger here. Another one is slightly smaller. So, the photographer must have got closer. And I say, not at all. I've carefully studied these images and noticed that the shooting point remains the same, and that dark gap is the platform. So, the platform on which the astronaut stood was moving. To make the figure slightly larger or smaller, there was a platform in front of the screen. It was on rails and moved slightly towards or away from the camera. That's all. They could shoot slightly left or right. This way, they got slightly different angles. What's interesting about these shots is that if an astronaut were actually on the moon, he would take one close-up, then a medium shot, a wide shot, and maybe pointed the camera somewhere. But here, there's none of that. Everything is from one point and roughly the same scale. What was before these four photos? We see the rover's fender, and then what do we see? Some sort of stick stuck in the ground, or something like that. They didn't bring sticks with them. So, what was there?
Could it be the flagpole?
It doesn't really look like it. In short, something is casting a shadow. We all know about chroma key. People ask, why didn't they just shoot everything with a chroma key? The answer is simple. They tried, but it didn't work well. Why? We are used to chroma key being green everywhere now. On TV, it's green, but in movies, blue chroma key was used for a long time. For example, the composite shots in Back to the Future were filmed using blue chroma key. I highlighted some elements on a white material, a white cloth. We see green reflections. Astronauts are supposed to be in white spacesuits. So, they filmed with a chroma key, and it turned out that when they removed the blue background to replace it with another image, it was unclear what to do with the reflections in the shadow areas. You see there, where the shadows are, under the arm, under the elbow, below. How to deal with blue reflections? What to do? So, they simply ruled out chroma key. Moreover, if there's any metal in the picture, especially sometimes when interviews are filmed with chroma key, and the person has glasses with metal frames, the color of the chroma key reflects in those frames. When they remove the chroma key, the frames of the glasses also disappear. So, they tried it, encountered many artifacts, and said, no, if we use chroma key, viewers will immediately realize something's fishy. Therefore, they sought a way to create an image in a single exposure without composite shots with masks and counter-masks. Because with chroma key, when we shoot against a green background, we must first create a black and white mask to block out the image. Then we make a counter mask to block out the background. Then, through one mask, we print one part of the image, and through the other mask, another part, and combine everything onto a separate film. So, there was no chroma key. Therefore, when people ask, was there chroma key? I can say with certainty that there was no chroma key in the moon missions. There were other methods that Kubrick developed, particularly front projection. Now we look at the Apollo 16 shots and see the same thing. A few promotional shots of an astronaut near the lunar module. You can see that in their structure or in how they were taken. These shots were taken in the same studio as Apollo 15. Therefore, I can say with certainty that these shots from Apollo 15 and Apollo 16 were filmed in the same studio and with the same front projection rig. They slightly changed the appearance of the mountain in the background, and so on. Again, we see that before the featured photos for the magazine, where the flag, the lunar module, and the rover are, there are some photos of the upper parts of the lunar module. Then again the rover seats, generally some unclear shots. I already mentioned that it's a stand-in mannequin. People say, how come? There are shots. Here are two shots. This shot and the adjacent one, where the astronaut jumped. And everyone says, look, you say they can't jump, but here he jumped up more than 40 centimeters. I combined these two shots into a GIF. And what did I see? It's the same mannequin hanging on a wire. So, these two shots are like two jumps.
Is the person's position the same?
They tried to change the position a bit, maybe the arm position. They hung it slightly differently on the wire, but these are clearly two identical shots. Once we reproduced the front projection technology. For the Zvezda TV channel on Cosmonautics Day, we did a story on how the Americans supposedly went to the moon. Here I am in a spacesuit. On the right side, the projector is off, and on the left side, the projector is on. Do you see the boundary that separates the studio from the image on the screen behind? Now I'll show the moment when we approach the semi-silvered mirror, getting to the point that aligns with the axis of the lens, and only then does the image flash on the screen. To summarize, in the Apollo 15 and 16 missions, there are many composite shots using a movie screen. When we watch the movie Terminator, we also see the use of movie screens in the background. I even brought a figure, as if from that movie. There's a scene where Sarah is running away from a tanker truck, and the tanker truck explodes in the background. Of course, filming in a city and blowing up a tanker truck is very dangerous. Who knows where the debris will fly? It could hit a building, the actress, or damage the camera. We know of such cases. So, they did it simpler. The tanker truck was made as a scale model. They set it up on a parking lot and placed an artificial tree there. They blew it up. If you look closely, the tree in the back is a pine or a fir, maybe a tuya. You can see it's fake. To avoid noticing it was a toy explosion, they filmed the explosion from different angles, slightly from the side and slightly from the front. In this case, the image was projected onto the screen from the back. This is called rear projection. There was a semi-translucent screen. It's clear how this technology works and what needs to be done. A pilot is flying a plane, and clouds are in the background. This technique is often used when someone is driving a car. You've probably seen it. In a car, they drive, and you can see that behind the window there is a projection on some movie screen of a pre-filmed background. The actress playing Sarah was running in front of a screen onto which pre-filmed material was projected. In the moon missions, a similar approach was employed. They pre-filmed the background and then set up either mannequins or some models in front of it, as if on the moon. Let's watch the clip. Here, she is hiding from a powerful explosion, running to the side, but this explosion is completely safe because it's on the movie screen. The screen was not very large, about 6 meters, because only front projection with a special movie screen allows for a projection on a 30-meter screen. And if it's a translucent screen, it was about 5 to 6 meters wide. So, Sarah was running not forward, but to the side of this screen. Look, now I'm showing the video. Toy. In the background, pieces of metal are falling, but they are completely safe because this explosion was filmed on a model in a completely different place. We see an unnaturally large flame. I think all contemporary viewers will immediately see that this is a toy, especially if they are prompted. Another scene. We see the main characters rejoicing that they have been saved. Hooray, hooray! And suddenly in the background, a skeleton rises from the fire. This skeleton was also pre-filmed and projected onto the movie screen. There was just one more thing. When it was necessary for the skeleton to turn its head and take steps, these steps were performed by an assistant who carried the skeleton piggyback. This was a plastic figure covered with a material that resembled metal. We see behind the scenes moments of the shooting. Therefore, in many shots, when it was necessary to show only the upper part, like the Terminator turning its head, like this skeleton walking, and if it was filmed down to the waist, it was shot in real time, with an actor walking. This is the first way to film a real moving object over time. But there are other shots. For example, when the skeleton rises from the fire, to show its movement, that it can not only move its arms and turn its head, but also walk, such a puppet was used. The next picture shows how it was filmed. This puppet figure was placed in front of the screen, and behind, on a frame-by-frame projector, a pre-filmed burning truck was shown. That is, we show one frame and wait. The animator slightly moved the hand, slightly raised it, as in a cartoon.
This is when 24 frames per second are filmed, and the background changes in 24 frames.
But that's not the case. They saved on everything and wanted to film quickly, so they did the following. Of course, they filmed 24 frames per second, but they said, the viewer won't notice, let's film 12 phases. That means they filmed one phase. Then they moved the hand higher or lifted the knee, or slightly turned the head, and filmed that phase twice. So, when I watch Terminator now, and we will see it too, this scene appears choppy. They saved on everything and filmed 12 phases. In the Moon epic, they went even further. They said, let's film 4 shots, and there will be 6 phases per second. They hurried, rushed, and filmed unprofessionally. When we watch on a big screen, and we will now see the Moon astronaut puppets, we will see so-called choppy animation. I want to draw your attention to the thing on the right, some kind of metal bar with a spoke. This is a very clever device. It is shown in this picture and is called a surface gauge. If you plan to shoot a puppet animation, you won't be able to shoot anything good without a surface gauge. Why is it needed? The thing is, you can't see the trajectory of a hand or foot movement in the air. To see it, you place the tip of the gauge near the current position of the foot. Then move the foot relative to it for the next frame. Remove the gauge, and take a picture. Then you bring the gauge back into the frame, adjust it to remember the previous position. The next position will be, let's say, 3 millimeters higher. Click, shot. Or, sometimes, they shoot with a movie film first, then see how high the foot is raised and move the puppet accordingly to achieve smooth movements. Let's watch the episode where the main character thinks they have destroyed the Terminator. We see that it's animation. Next, the main characters run down the corridor, escaping from the skeleton. We see this figure up to its knees. In reality, it was about this size. Apparently, it was twice as tall as mine. Next to the skeleton, we see the animator who creates the movements. Behind them is the edge of the movie screen. So, the filmed corridor pass was projected frame by frame onto the background, and the puppet stood in front of it. Since the puppet couldn't move on its own, they needed to avoid showing the rig where it was attached to the platform below. Therefore, they only showed it up to the knees. Even if they lifted one leg, there's a chance the puppet could fall, and they needed to shoot one long take. This filming could take a day or two. A lot of time is spent adjusting each frame precisely. That's why the legs aren't shown. They are there, but they are attached with some material, like how it's attached to the stand here. So, the legs can move, but only to a limited extent. What do we see? Now let's watch it in motion. Do you see how the background moves? You can tell the background moves like animation. In the back, there's a movie screen, and it's projected onto it. Now, having watched The Terminator, discussed these techniques, movie screens, and puppets with hidden legs, what do we see in common with the Moon epic? It's the same in the Moon epic. Here are two astronauts seemingly brushing dust off the lens with a brush, but actually, they are two puppets. And that's why we don't see their legs. Let's say all these movements are very strange. Look at the right side of the screen, the one on your right, one arm hangs at an angle. This arm closest to us doesn't move. So, the animators saved on everything, and made it so that only the arm with the brush appears to be cleaning.
It jerked.
Both hands mostly hang down. Only one hand was animated, and they filmed it quickly, using puppets. These types of puppets were used because the Americans figured that if they were in a spacesuit, which is also inflated from the inside, the movements would be stiff, and no one would be able to tell the difference from a real astronaut. So that's how they filmed it.
And there's the golden helmet, so you can't see the faces anyway.
Yes, there's a lot of bright light, so the helmet is very dark and golden, reducing the light by almost 95%. But in reality, we can't see the faces for another reason. The filming of each mission was done about 2 or even 3 years before the premiere, so no one knew which astronaut would participate. For example, just 3 months before the launch, it became certain that Armstrong would be appointed. But as early as 1965, Kubrick was assigned to the Apollo 11 epic. Filming began in 1966. Kubrick was supposed to develop the technology for projection onto a giant screen by 1967, but as you know, A Space Odyssey came out a year later, in 1968. He spent an entire year trying to make the projection on a giant screen. He didn't like it, saying that viewers would immediately see and figure out that these were composite shots. So, everyone was very dissatisfied with Kubrick. They said, well, where's your technology? Where's your giant screen? Where are the mountains? Therefore, in the first Apollo missions 11, 12, 14, there are no lunar mountains because Kubrick's technology had not yet been handed over to NASA. But they had to film it. I want to emphasize once again that in 1969 the first supposed moon landing happened, but it was actually filmed in 1966 and 1967. By 1967, everything was already completed, and the new mission was being filmed. Therefore, you can't see the faces. The real actors playing the astronauts in the video are about 30 to 40 centimeters shorter. And there were many puppets. The Apollo 15 and 16 missions are particularly interesting due to the extensive use of puppets. I took the movie The Gold Rush. I think you immediately figured out the trick.
A puppet that fell out, but it's clearly visible, of course.
Yes, I specifically selected a sequence where we least expected Charlie Chaplin to be replaced by a puppet. Moreover, when we watch the breathtaking, dizzying stunts of Buster Keaton, there are also shots where the actor is replaced by a puppet. For example, in Sherlock Jr., there are at least 2 such sequences. Let me show you one of those episodes.
Yes, it's clear that the model was used so that the top came flying.
Of course, with real actors, such a shot would be very difficult to do, but with a model, they just pulled a string and the top fell off. What is this technique about? In The Gold Rush with Charlie Chaplin, they showed the actor, then briefly replaced him with a puppet, and then put the actor back in. It makes us think that everywhere, in close-ups, medium shots, and wide shots, there was a real person. The Americans did something similar in the moon missions. They showed a real person in some medium shots, and a puppet in the wide shots. Let's analyze a few moments from this moon epic. You know that according to the fable, they moved around on a rover. I circled the TV camera. Here it is in the front, and the movie camera. The movie camera was 16 millimeters. It was indeed a real 16 millimeters Maurer film camera. They said, to save film, we shot not at 24 frames per second, but 4 times less, and then in the lab we duplicated these frames. But the point is, that puppets and models were needed to make the long trip across the moon. It's impossible to build such a giant set and light it up with a single light source. But making small puppets and a set the size of half a soccer field is doable. It stands out to me. That's a toy TV camera. You can see it's fake. I showed these two images for this reason. We see that in one image, the shadow falls to the right, and in this image, the shadow falls to the left. That means the rover first went in one direction, then turned around and went in the opposite direction. Here's the rover's trajectory. It's not a straight line or an arc, but a winding path through the same area in different directions. So, the set was small, about half the size of a soccer field.
They wrote that they couldn't be more than 5 kilometers away from the rocket, meaning the descent module.
Well, yes, but it wasn't 5 kilometers.
If they had gone further and broken down, they wouldn't have been able to return. So, they circled around, right?
They were winding, but it was only 50 meters. Toy models and moving carts were used in Thomas and Friends. Here, we see toy stationary engine drivers, while the train is filmed in real time. There's a painted mountain in the background. I wanted to say, on a piece of old canvas, like in the fairy tale about Pinocchio. Now the camera is mounted on the train and moves with it. The landscape unfolds before us. Similarly, many moon rides were filmed in this puppet animation style. I want to show again that there really was a 16 millimeters camera in the middle of the rover. The filmed footage looks as if there were a TV camera in front, which keeps shaking all the time. For over 5 minutes, the camera goes left, then right, turns around, and goes on for a long time. Do you remember when I showed how 2 puppets were cleaning the lens with a brush? People asked me, what's so difficult about that? Why not use actors instead of puppets to make it look like they're cleaning? I said, you see, if you shoot different cuts, it will have one effect. But if the rover supposedly drove on the moon for 5 minutes, and suddenly astronauts come out from off-screen and clean the lens in front of us, it creates a completely different effect. It looks like a real continuous ride. Since the drive was filmed using puppet animation, at the end of the long 5-minute ride, puppets come out from the side and start cleaning the lens, turning the camera, supposedly shaking the antenna, and doing other movements. In fact, there were many puppets. The Apollo 15 and 16 missions are particularly notable for the fact that there were a lot of puppets used. The most famous ride in the Apollo 16 mission was filmed with a 30-centimeter puppet on a remote-controlled model. The puppet was about this size.
This one is smaller.
Yes, this one is a bit smaller, just 18 centimeters. The puppet was bigger, about this size. These are some of the most famous shots. In terms of citation, they are second only to the shots of Armstrong descending the ladder. Any propaganda film about American space achievements will definitely include the episode, Astronaut Driving the Rover. They ask, why use a puppet? Why not film a real person? How do you show that the sand flies up high? When you use some model, a puppet toy, the sand flies up 20 centimeters. But if you scale that up to a full-size real rover, it becomes about 1.5 meters high. Under Earth's conditions, it's impossible to make sand fly up 1.5 meters at that speed. Their speed was, I think, on average
12, but during Apollo 16, there was a record of 18. On average, they drove at 12 to 15 kilometers per hour. By the way, that's fast for the moon.
But if they drive at 10 kilometers per hour, and we film a real rover at full scale in the studio, the sand won't fly up 1.5 meters at that speed.
You'd need a propeller shaft.
Or very fast wheels spinning, but that would be noticeable. So, they used a small model, and the sand flies up 20 centimeters. Moreover, you can see in many shots that the sand flies up unnaturally. There were hidden compressor hoses underneath, and when the wheel rolled over them, it pressed and sand shot out. You can see that sometimes the sand doesn't fly from under the wheel but at a 90-degree angle in a completely different direction. Another interesting point, when astronauts trained on this rover on Earth, their hands always rested on their knees. But with the puppet, the left hand is always in the air and swinging. It's not difficult to film a toy buggy to make it look real. In reality, we're seeing a small remote-controlled toy model. Look, it's practically a lunarscape. See how it bounces. People say to me, you know, there's a lot of fine dust here, so it's clear this was shot in the air. But in the lunar footage, which we'll see now, there's no such strong dust.
By the way, yes, its hand is in the air. It's uncomfortable to hold it like that. For the figure, it should be on the knee.
He makes 2 circles.
Indeed, it's uncomfortable to hold the hand in the air.
Of course, especially if you make one turn, return.
The simplest thing is to rest it on a support.
They made this so that the arm would swing when this toy car moves over bumps. Otherwise, the puppet appears completely still. In all these shots, they never show an astronaut approaching, sitting down, and driving off. They show a close-up or medium shot of him approaching the rover. And then, in a completely different shot from afar, they show the rover moving. Once again, I'll say this is supposedly one of the most famous achievements of American space science, the greatest achievement of the 20th century, puppets on a remote-controlled model. If you look closely at this footage, you can see a sharp boundary, which I indicated with arrows. This is like in a diorama, where a semicircular studio is made, and an artist painted a continuation of the background behind it. These mountains are painted by an artist. What's also interesting about this rover is that astronauts could not get into it on their own. Imagine you have a heavy spacesuit that doesn't bend well. During training, they were not pressurized. He stands straight, so the backpack is empty, yet 2 or 3 assistants help him get in. The question is, how did they climb in without assistance on the moon? They didn't, because there were no astronauts on the moon, only toys.
Not on the moon, but in the footage presented as the moon. He almost stood up and got out on his own.
Look, the backpack is an empty box because the life support backpack weighs 2/3 of the astronaut's weight. It's like if you were asked to carry a big sack of potatoes. You would need to lean heavily. That's why you can see him standing straight with an empty box. Actors playing astronauts on the moon sometimes forgot they had an empty backpack, so they ran straight without leaning. If we look at other scenes, whether from Apollo 15 or Apollo 16, we will see a well-practiced Hollywood technique that we have seen in movies. First, they show a person, then for a difficult stunt, they use a puppet, and then they show a person again. Here, they did it differently. First, they show a puppet walking around and doing something, then they show a person, and suddenly it turns out that this person is moving their hands and doing something. Then they show the ride from afar, where the astronaut supposedly sits on the rover, drives off, and rides for 5 minutes. So, in the middle, they inserted a real person, and before and after that, it was a puppet. We can see that the lunarscape in the background looks slightly different. The puppet lunarscape and the large-scale lunarscape don't quite match each other precisely. If we look closely, we can see a puppet at the beginning. Remember how I said in the Terminator, when the puppet is walking, they only show the upper part?
Yes, a waist shot.
At the beginning, we see a puppet, and then on the left, a real person, and on the right, a puppet again. At first, they only show the upper part, and we don't see the legs. That means a person is standing below and holding this puppet. The filming is in real time. That's why they tied a sheet, and it sways in the wind, at least something is moving. But the left hand hangs still for 40 seconds straight. Allegedly, this astronaut is adjusting something on the antenna, doing something else, and you can see that the hand is completely motionless.
Looks like a prosthetic.
And now they edited it. Allegedly, this same astronaut is now taking some device, probably called a gnomon with a color scale and a gray scale. We see that all his fingers are moving, he's doing something, adjusting. We, the viewers, according to NASA, are supposed to believe that this is a real astronaut on the moon, and that before this moment, it was also an astronaut, and that after this moment, it will also be an astronaut. But what's interesting is that now this astronaut will sit on the rover, but he couldn't get in by himself. So, what do the Americans do? They supposedly show with a 16mm camera that he approaches, is supposed to climb in, but then, cut, and a puppet is already sitting there. The most crucial moment, how the astronaut sat down, isn't shown. Cut, and that's it, he's already sitting.
And the camera in front should have shown how he gets in, right? Those are really close-up shots.
Then the animation started. Interestingly, here we see a wheel entering the picture on the right, and there is no moon dust. The fact is, in other shots, there is dust. Which other shots? The ones filmed in real-time scale with a toy rover. You see, from time to time, the wheel enters the shot. I reviewed all these rides. There's no dust. You see, the orange fender enters the shot on the right. Since this was shot frame by frame, there is no dust flying around. I'm showing that before this, they filmed the puppet in real-time scale, and there, dust falls from the wheels, both front and rear. But when they shoot frame by frame, none of this is showing. So, these very famous shots, the long rides on the moon, all of this is puppets filmed in a studio, with either a painted background or a projection on a movie screen. If we look at other shots, like the docking, well, friends, these are such ridiculous models that it's just embarrassing to talk about. So, to sum up, what do the movie Terminator and the moon missions Apollo 15 and 16 have in common? A lot. There are many composite shots using a movie screen. The actor runs in front of the movie screen, and on the right, the rover drives on the moon. These are the same composite shots. Nothing real is shown. In the moon missions, actors were only shown in medium and close-up shots. And when they needed to show a distant lunarscape, a convincing ride, they used small puppets. In the movie Terminator, we saw that in some cases, they use the upper part of the skeleton to create an illusion. And when they need to show a more general plan, they place a puppet, filmed using animation. Of course, these shootings are very primitive, but that was the level of the 60s and 70s.
I think they had such resources that they could make a person not 1-to-1 but larger or smaller. I mean, these were still puppets. But I understand that the rover needed to be made smaller, so that the dust from the wheels would scatter more strongly.
And to film a large area. In Hollywood, they typically like to film models at a scale of 1-to-6 and sometimes 1-to-10.
The train in the movie Back to the Future that falls off the bridge is at a 1-to-6 scale.
Yes. In True Lies with Schwarzenegger, the truck in the bridge explosion sequence was also made at a 1-to-6 scale. First of all, such models create the illusion of being less toy-like, and secondly, such models can be filmed in a studio. So, in a large studio, you can organize a space to look like a giant lunarscape.
By the way, Kubrick used the largest English studio, occupying absolutely all the sound stages there. In that studios, they could film an entire castle or a plane. I mean, before them, whatever they filmed, he took it all for himself. They struggled with this for 2 years.
That's what I mean. They spent an entire year just working out the front projection technology on a giant screen.
Do you remember that at that time, all the new developments were invented by the Japanese, like Scotchlight?
Yes, for the first time, it was used in a film Matango, shot about 3 years before Kubrick.
Some terrible trash film where they ate mushrooms and turned into mutants. Some weird sci-fi films in the Japanese style that probably only they can watch.
I think after our broadcast, everyone will want to find Matango on the internet. In what scene was front projection used there? A ship or something like that, not sure, is sailing on the sea, and there are 7 or 8 people talking. The sea in the background is a projection on the screen. I roughly estimated that their screen was about
small,
not large.
Unlike Space Odyssey, this film had a low budget. The Japanese simply didn't have that kind of money. Kubrick was initially given $5 million, but he ended up spending more, around $12 million. He spent $750,000 on just a centrifuge.
Yes.
The only thing I can say is that, although the space industry might not have advanced much because of it, the film industry certainly made significant progress.
Yes.
Our viewers in the comments under the video said that Armstrong is the most underrated actor in Hollywood history.
Do you know why that might be? Because almost everywhere Armstrong was replaced by stand-ins.
For Space Odyssey, Kubrick received an Oscar for visual effects, even though he didn't handle the special effects. The only Oscar Space Odyssey received was for Best Visual Effects. However, Space Odyssey wasn't just him, it was a collective effort, and not only those who were on the set but all the innovations that were made.
That's the supervisor's role.
Armstrong was also in the spotlight, so he should have received an Oscar too.
Do you know that on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in America, there is a star for Armstrong? The Apollo 11 astronauts are listed there. So, he received his star as an actor, and there is his star on the Walk of Fame. Unfortunately, in the photographs, Armstrong was depicted by dolls in the long shots and mannequins near the lunar module. In the videos, Armstrong was portrayed by actors who were about 40 centimeters shorter. Indeed, he is underrated only because so many stand-ins portrayed one actor. He himself just smiled and attended press conferences. It was noticeable that at the post-flight press conference, which took place a month later, his hands were shaking, and he clenched his fists while speaking. It was hard for him to lie. We know that later he became a recluse and tried to stay out of the public eye. It was a heavy burden for him.
So, we are wrapping up. We discussed the 17th mission, which also featured rovers. By the way, there's always talk about how the rover was delivered there. I heard it was supposedly attached to the side.
Yes, on the side. But that disrupts the balance. Of course, even when we launch fireworks, if the balance is off, the petard, instead of flying straight or on a curve, starts spinning. So, when they attached the rover to the side, there should have been some counterweight on the other side.
Another rover or a cosmonaut.
There has to be a counterweight.
Cosmonaut of the same weight, or the spacesuit filled with bricks. When you mentioned that they bend over, but on the moon the weight is 6 times less, they should weigh 30 kilograms. It is believed that the astronaut along with the spacesuit weighed 180 kilograms. So, 30.
I believe that with the spacesuit, which was 22 kilograms. By the way, now everyone understands that the spacesuit cannot be that light. Therefore, they attributed a weight of 91 kilograms to that spacesuit. But if we look at the astronomical encyclopedia published before the advent of the Internet, it says only 54 kilograms. No one has yet invented such a light spacesuit. It's technology from the 22nd or 23rd century. We know that the spacesuits used for spacewalks on the ISS weigh 120 kilograms. And there's even an American model weighing over 150 kilograms. How much would a lunar spacesuit weigh? Maybe a bit less, but it's still very heavy.
I also want to mention the rocket. We launched our Angara. It's the latest technology, our breakthrough. But if we compare it with the characteristics of Saturn V, it's 5 times less powerful. How did that happen?
And it's the most powerful oxygen kerosene engine in the world. The most powerful in the world.
In the last broadcast, you explained how all this could happen, and that Saturn is a strangely configured rocket with only 5 engines. Here's just an example. The newest rocket that exists on the Earth is 5 times less powerful than the one that supposedly took Americans to the moon. So, it's a mismatch. Again, Americans still can't make anything even remotely similar.
Yes, these are not 21st or 22nd century technologies. These are Hollywood technologies from the 20th century.
They also had aliens. In Space Odyssey, Kubrick wanted to show aliens, but it turned out to be too expensive, so he couldn't do it. Maybe it's the same here. Besides the ones we showed, Von Braun also had aliens working for him.
Interesting theory.
So, let's summarize. Your final verdict on all American Apollo missions.
I showed several panoramas from the Apollo missions 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and so on. Almost all of them. We see that in nearly all of them, the wide shots are filmed in a studio using models. We see that to create panoramic views and ensure viewers don't realize it's a studio, the video is made in very poor quality, making it hard to make out any details. But when a high-quality promotional photo is needed for publication in magazines, they use front projection technique. These photos, taken with front projection, are of very high quality, allowing for detailed examination when enlarged. They are taken separately and stand isolated among other magazines. We see that completely different techniques were used. Just like in any movie, here one technique, there another, here a puppet, there a mannequin, here a double from behind, and so on. Therefore, of course, no real mission could have happened. The Saturn V launch vehicle did not fly higher than 17 kilometers. Moreover, everyone who worked at NASA knew very well that by 1965 they had already started filming the hoax. No one was really planning to fly. They were conducting experiments and developing technologies to convincingly create the illusion of moon landing. So, when people say, well, they hoped until the last moment that something would work out, it's not true. They didn't even intend to. 4 years before 1969, the supposed first moon landing, they were already looking for directors, selecting studios, searching for technologies, and finding ways to fake it, rather than actually making a real spacesuit. They still don't have a lunar spacesuit, even now.
Yes, in the Artemis mission, they only showed a prototype, but it doesn't work.
So, there were talks about landing on the moon in 2024. Now Artemis has been pushed to the right. In 2025 there will be nothing, and in 2026, nothing. We can confidently say that until 2030 or even 2033, no one will go. The technology for safely landing on the moon and safely returning to Earth hasn't been developed yet. Even now, just landing on the moon without crashing is a big challenge.
Only the Chinese managed it. I actually believe the Chinese will be on the moon.
Their automatic probe has already started towards the moon, it's flying in orbit and it's ready to land.
I believe they landed the Jade Rabbit there in 2014. Yes, they were the next ones after our Luna 24. Luna 25 didn't work out. It crashed. Well, then we're wrapping up. My personal opinion is that the Chinese will be on the moon because they need it, while no one else does.
We now have a joint moon station project. We are already developing some hangars there. So, interest in the moon has revived with new strength because we are becoming a sovereign power. We haven't fully achieved this yet. We are still very dependent on Western influence in many ways. We haven't fully freed ourselves from these chains yet. I hope that gradually we will break free, and then our science and technology will flourish, and we will make a giant leap forward, just like almost 90 years ago during the years of industrialization.
Just a directive to the new cabinet of ministers to invest more money in science, because without science and our own technologies, the country cannot exist. Back in the 90s, we used to say we'd buy everything. We won't buy anything. If there are sanctions, we need to have everything of our own and focus on localizing production.
Yes, so no one can press a button and say, that's it, all your phones don't work, all your computers with Windows have shut down. Everything has turned into a brick.
Thank you very much. I'd like to remind our viewers that we had a cameraman, Leonid Konovalov, as our guest. Over 3 episodes, we discussed all the American moon missions, and Leonid Konovalov explained how all this filming could have been made on Earth, in earthly conditions. I hope you found it interesting. Leave your comments under this video, and we'll discuss it. And subscribe to the Day TV channel on various platforms. Take care. See you.